As mentioned, he is the Emeritus Professor of Applied Linguistics in the School of Linguistics and Applied Languages Studies at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. He has a number of books, a few of which are How Vocabulary is Learned in 2017, Teaching Extensive Reading in Another Language, 2020, and second editions of the Language Curriculum Design, Teaching ESL or EFL Listening and Speaking, and Teaching ESL, EFL Reading and Writing. I do want to say a little bit, we had the opportunity to have a special workshop with Professor Paul Nation yesterday, and his insights into teaching and learning of English to both ESL and EFL learners is really, really useful. I learned a lot, and I will probably not look at English words and their stems the same for the rest of my life. So he also has a lot of free resources on his website. Please do check that out, as Professor Popoma has already mentioned. And just a friendly reminder to ask questions using the chat function. We will curate those questions for the Q&A session at the end of this keynote. And without further ado, I just want to pass the time over to Professor Paul Nation.
Okay. Good. Now we'll share the screen. Okay. You can hear me, I guess. I will try.
We can hear you, Paul.
Yeah, good. Okay. I tried from the beginning, but it doesn't seem to want to do that. But,
what about slideshow? Oh, here we go.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so today I want to talk briefly about what I think is a very important principle of language course design, and that is called the principle of the 4 strands. And it's really a curriculum design principle, but it's a principle that teachers need to operate when they teach. And even if you're teaching with a course book, I think this principle is really important. The principle of the 4 strands says this: if you want to know if you've got a well-balanced language course, then you really should check whether your course has 4 different strands. There's the strand of meaning-focused input, where learners learn from listening and reading. The strand of meaning-focused output, where learners learn from speaking and writing. The language-focused learning strand, which involves deliberate learning. And the fluency development strand. And in a well-balanced language course, which includes what happens in the classroom and outside of the classroom, there should be roughly equal amounts of each of these 4 strands. And ideally, the strands should be connected to each other through sharing similar content material. So that's the principle of the strands then, that there should be 4 strands which run through a course. And the idea of a strand is that it's something which continues. So right from the elementary stages of a course to the advanced stages of a course, there should be a meaning-focused input strand, and there should be a fluency development strand, and an output strand, and a deliberate learning strand. I used to illustrate the meaning of strand by plucking a strand of hair from my head. I can no longer afford to do that, but you should get the idea that the strand is something long and continuous. And when you look at a course, you might not see these separate strands if you're an uninformed outsider, you might just see that there's learning going on and the learners are doing activities and the teacher is occasionally teaching and so on. But the course really, a good balanced course, is providing opportunities to learn through each of these 4 strands. Now, each strand has certain criteria or conditions for it to exist. The meaning-focused input strand, that is, learning through reading and learning through listening, should involve comprehensible material. That is, there should be only a very small amount of unfamiliar material in what the learners are listening to or reading. From a vocabulary perspective, this material should make up no more than about 2% of the running words in any of the listening passages or the reading passages and so on. So that would mean on a page of 300 words, there should be no more than about 6 unknown words. So the material then needs to be comprehensible to the learner. It's good if they bring some background knowledge to it, but it's not essential. There should be a low density of unfamiliar language features. So from a vocab perspective, no more than about 2 out of every 100 words should be unfamiliar words. And there should be a focus on the message. That is, the learners are listening to comprehend or they're reading to comprehend. Their goal is not to focus on language features, but to focus on the content of what's being communicated. So they are the 3 criteria for meaning-focused input. The meaning-focused output strand, it's very similar. There needs to be material which is largely, but not completely familiar. The learners are having to speak and write about things which are on the edge of their language knowledge. And there should be a focus on the message, that is, that their concern is getting their message across through speaking or through writing. The language-focused learning strand is a part of the course where the teacher does or can do some teaching, but quite a big part of the language-focused learning strand should be the learners taking control of their own deliberate learning. It differs from the other 3 strands in that it involves a conscious focus on language features. In the meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, and fluency development strands, the learners work with material where they're focusing on understanding the content of the material, getting messages and producing messages. But in the language-focused learning strand, there's language study of features of listening, speaking, reading, writing, pronunciation, spelling, grammar, vocabulary, word parts, discourse. Okay, the 4th strand is the fluency development strand, and this, like the other 3 strands, each of the other 3 strands should make up about 1/4 of the course time. So about 1/4 of the time in a course should be spent getting fluent with what learners already know. And the requirement of the fluency development strand is that it involves really easy material. There is no unfamiliar vocabulary, no unfamiliar grammar, and the content is largely familiar to the learners. Their main focus is getting onto that material as quickly and dealing with it as quickly and as fluently as possible. It helps in fluency development activities if there is pressure on the learner to go faster in their reading, or to go a bit faster in their listening, or to go faster in their speaking or writing. And like the strands of input and output, there is a focus on the message. The learner's goal is to actually receive communications and to present communications, focusing on the content of what is being comprehended or presented. So let's now quickly look at each of those strands. The main parts of a meaning-focused input strand would be extensive listening and extensive reading. Extensive listening has now moved, I think, into the beginnings of a new age, where we can now speed up and slow down recorded input, and it doesn't sound very strange or high-pitched to us. It can be speeded up or slowed down and still preserve the quality of the normal spoken language. And this seems to me a great benefit for learning through meaning-focused input. The internet is a major source for extensive listening, and I think as the technology develops, we'll have more and more resources that we can use. If any of you are computer programmers, for me, the big thing that is missing at the moment is some program which can be used to adapt video and listening material in the same way that we can adapt reading material to suit the vocabulary level of the learners. It would be really great to have a program where you could take a piece of spoken language or video, such as a TED talk or even a recorded podcast, analyze it according to the vocabulary in it, and then go through and replace the words which are way beyond the learner's level with words which are within the learner's level of the same meaning, and the judgment of the person applying it would be used to do that. But this would then be integrated back into the program without too much of a blip in the change in pronunciation and so on. Well, I think all the technology is there, someone's just got to do it. So meaning-focused input involves extensive listening and extensive reading. Meaning-focused output involves what we could call extensive speaking and extensive writing. In speaking activities, we can have monologic speaking where somebody delivers a talk. We can have speaking in conversation, informal conversation between pairs of people, and we can have speaking which involves larger groups and problem-solving activities. And similarly, writing has a range of different writing purposes and so on, and the meaning-focused output strand should be roughly divided 50-50 into speaking and writing. The third strand of language-focused learning is the one where the teacher can do a little bit of teaching through intensive reading, for example, focusing in intensive reading on vocabulary or word part analysis or on pronunciation or spelling or grammatical features and so on. And the teacher and the learners can work through material in intensive reading, and that can make up part of the language-focused learning strand. Flashcard learning of vocabulary, I'm a great advocate of that. I've looked at all the research I can find on the deliberate rote learning of vocabulary, and the research is overwhelmingly in support of decontextualized vocabulary learning as a small part of a well-balanced language course. If that was the only vocabulary learning that took place, it would be not such a good thing. But as part of a well-balanced language course, deliberate use of a flashcard program or hard copy flashcards for learning vocabulary is highly efficient and highly effective. Teaching of language features is another part of the language-focused learning strand. So when the teacher gets up and teaches bits of grammar and so on like that, then that can be considered as language-focused learning. A very important part of the language-focused learning strand is teaching learners strategies to take control of their own learning, training them in developing autonomy on learning. And this can involve learning particular strategies, such as the flashcard strategy. There are certain things, there are good ways to do rote learning, and there are bad ways to do rote learning. And the good ways to do rote learning are fairly clear, and learners should be taught that strategy. Another strategy is the word part strategy of breaking words into parts and doing it. And another strategy is the dictionary use strategy, where learners are trained in how to use dictionaries to support their learning and how to learn from a dictionary, not just use it to look up something, but to use it to help vocabulary become part of their knowledge. Learners should really understand the principles of learning And it's important then that they can apply these principles and then start to take control of their own learning. If I'm very generous towards published course books, I would say about at least half of the material in the course books involve language-focused learning. In some of the not so good course books, as much as 3/4 of the course book involves language-focused learning. And so what this means for a language teacher is, if you only teach from a course book, your learners are really missing out on some very important opportunities for learning. They're missing out, for example, on extensive reading, because you couldn't possibly fit the amount of extensive reading that learners need to do into a course book. And you couldn't have it available at so many different levels for the range of proficiency levels in the classroom. And similarly with fluency development. Course books can't include the material that you need for a reading fluency course or a writing fluency course or a listening fluency course, because it would just simply make the textbook too large and bulky. So it's really important then that if your teachers are working from a course book, they figure out what parts of the course book are language-focused learning and what parts are input and output and fluency development, and they should try to make up the balance of the equal amount across the 4 strands. The fluency development strand needs to occur in each of the 4 skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And that means learners need to become fluent in listening, they need to become fluent in speaking, they need to become fluent in reading, and they need to become fluent in writing. Fluency involves not going super fast, but just getting up to something close to a native speaker speed of processing the language, which is not terribly fast, but making the best use of what is already known. Courses often deal with a lot of new material, but they often don't provide enough opportunity for that material to enter the learner's fluent knowledge of the language. And so the fluency development strand, which should take up about 1/4 of the total time in a language course, tries to do that. Now let's look at the teaching activities which can be used across the 4 strands of a course. As I talk about these activities, you might try to fit them into the strand that applies to that activity. So, for example, extensive listening, where learners listen and watch videos at the right level for them. And so that would fit into the meaning-focused input strand. Well, what I'm going to do in the next slide is give you the answers for which strand each of these activities fit into. But you could try to jump ahead and just see if you can work out which strand something would fit into. Listening to stories is one of my favorite activities. The teacher sits down at the front of the class, sits comfortably by the blackboard, has a graded reader or a book which is at the right level for the learners, and then reads it as almost like a parent reading a story to the class. If you are teaching at an advanced level where you're teaching, science subjects and things like that, you can still do this kind of activity by giving a kind of mini lecture. And when words occur which may be difficult for the learners to recognize, the teacher simply writes the word on the whiteboard and then carries on. When you start the reading to the learners, you repeat each phrase twice and you go rather slowly. And then you do that for about 10 minutes, then stop. And then the next time the class meets, you'll carry on like a serial and keep doing it like that. And as it goes on, you get faster and faster doing it. What strand do you think that fits into? I think it fits into 2 strands, actually. So if you're trying to figure out your answer, have a go at that. I think it fits into the meaning-focused input strand through listening, and I think it then develops to become fluency development. As the learners get more familiar with the story, then the teacher can go faster and faster until they're working at a level where there are really not a lot of difficulties, and the only challenge is keeping up with the teacher's speed of presentation. Read and listen, which means reading while listening. This is a very useful activity. So some learners can read better than they can listen, and so reading can support their listening. And vice versa, if learners are quite good at listening but not that good at reading, then the reading can support, listening can support the reading. I think that fits into the meaning-focused input strand of a course because the focus is still on understanding the message. Dictation. This is a very old technique, but it's one that I like a lot. I think that will fit into the language-focused learning strand. So that you can see that listening involves meaning-focused input through extensive listening, some fluency development through listening to stories, and some language-focused learning through dictation activities. So each of the skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing can involve input-output strands, language-focused learning strand, and the fluency development strand. So here we have the other techniques, and I won't spend much time because we're getting near the end of my time for the talk. If you want to learn more about each of these activities, then there are two ways you can do that, and it's quite good to use both ways. You can get one of my favorite books that I've written. The book that I really most enjoyed writing, and I thought was the most useful book I've ever written, is called What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? It's important to get EFL because I also wrote a book called What Should Every ESL Teacher Know? But this book is deliberately not expensive because I made it a requirement to the publisher that when they publish the book, it has to be cheap enough for teachers to be able to easily afford it. And that book really puts down the essence of what I've been saying today with lots of examples from the various skills of listening, speaking, writing, and other things. And you'll find each of these activities described in there. If you go to my website, you'll find a link to videos which also illustrate some of these activities in video form. So with speaking then, we have paired conversation and talks and problem-solving things. Then we have the 4-3-2 activity, one of my favorite ones. And this is a listening fluency development activity. And then we have various reading, extensive reading. I think every language course should have some kind of extensive reading component. Even when learners are studying at advanced levels, the extensive reading can be reading substantial academic texts, and that can become a part of extensive reading. Okay, here are the activities put into the 4 strands. I've got MF5 for meaning-focused input, and LFL for language-focused learning and output. And you can see that if you look across these activities, there should be a balance of activities across the 4 strands of a course. And you will notice that in each of the 4 skills of listening, speaking, and reading and writing, there will be opportunities for input or output, language-focused learning, and also fluency development. Okay. If you want to follow up on what I've been saying, then the references here are a useful guide to that. There's the book, What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? You can get it electronically through Amazon. There's an article which you can find on my website. If you go to my website page and look up under publications, then you'll find an article on applying the 4 strands, and then you'll find the original article on the 4 strands also available free on my website there. And then there's my link to my resources, but if you just type Paul Nations resources into Google, that will get you there. Well, I think I should stop talking now and see if you have any questions or comments on what I've been saying. Nicholas, are you going to handle the questions? Or?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Professor Nishan, for that insightful presentation. And thank you to our participants and audience for your questions. We do have a number of questions. Let me get to the first one. So one of the questions was whether there's an online tool that would allow us to adapt reading materials to reduce the vocabulary load for the purpose of meaning-focused input that would be really helpful for teachers.
Yes, there are both online tools and tools you can download from the web. The tools that I use to adapt materials can be downloaded from the web, and the best one I think is Ant Word Profiler. This is free from Lawrence Anthony's website, and Lawrence and I worked together to design this tool for adapting materials. Tom Cobb also has a website called The Complete Lexical Tutor, which has a vocabulary profiler. But there are limits on what the profiler can do, whereas the Ant Word Profiler can actually handle very large texts and adapt them. I and others have been using the Ant Word Profiler to adapt texts at the 4,000, 6,000 and 8,000 word level for advanced students to bridge the gap between graded readers and unsimplified text. And you can adapt a fairly large book in probably about 7 or 8 hours, which is not bad for a book about 100,000 words long, using this tool.
Okay, thank you for those resources. Ladies and gentlemen, I have put the link to the Ant Word Profiler in the chat, and it's wonderful. It's freeware. So when you were mentioning earlier, you know, if there are people who are able to do something with video and audio, were you thinking about something like this, but for video and audio?
Yes, I think it's possible now. The technology is there. For example, to take my talk and then to run a written version of my talk, and you can now use, you know, you can convert spoken language to written text, run it through a vocab profiler, highlight the words which need to be changed, and then you can have a tool like Ant Word Profiler, which instead of editing a written text, then edits a spoken text. And it's now possible, of course, to mimic the voice of the original text to some degree. And it seems to me not a bad idea not to mimic it too much so that learners know that something has been changed, but it's not a big interruption to the speaking. And so the big problem with extensive listening is there's lots of listening material, but a lot of it's far too difficult. And if we could run it through a vocab profiler and adapt this video or podcast material, this would be an enormous resource for extensive listening.
Sure. Thank you for that.
The technology is all there. It's just got to be brought together.
Yeah, somebody needs to put it together and make it easy to work with for teachers.
Yeah, so I want to add, though, that the program wouldn't make the substitution of the vocabulary. You'd have to have somebody sitting there making that judgment for each word and phrase and so on, because it's expecting too much of the program.
Sure. Thank you for that. Another question that we had in the chat, probably perhaps more philosophical, conceptual. Are we still aspiring for native-like fluency in English, given that we now acknowledge World Englishes as legitimate versions of the language? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think, well, the native speaker goal is really, for me, I see that argument as being a kind of pronunciation argument, and I'm not too hung up on that. You know, there's so many different native speaker pronunciations of English. I see no problem in adding to that list. But for me, fluency doesn't mean sounding like a native speaker. It means being able to process language that is either receptively or productively, at a speed which is typical to the normal native speaker type speed. Now, see, I think that even within the first week of learning English, learners should be fluent in what they've learned. Now, not a lot of people know this, but I'm actually fluent in Japanese. But I'm only fluent in a vocabulary of a couple of hundred words.
Right.
So if I meet somebody, I can really impress them for about 3 or 4 minutes by you know, rishiku onegaishimasu, you know, and carry on like this. And they think, wow, this guy's good. But I'm only good in what I know.
Right.
But the important thing is that what I know, I'm good at, I'm fluent at. And so you can be fluent from day one in the very limited knowledge that you have. And as your proficiency develops, you shouldn't be waiting till the end of the course to become fluent. You should be fluent from the beginning of the course in whatever you are learning in the course. And that's why the strand of fluency development needs to occur at every level of proficiency and in every course, regardless of what's going on.
Right. So I actually have a follow-up question to that, and there's a couple of things that people are talking about in the chat. So with going back to the 4 strands, and I really like this idea of fluency and being fluent in even 100 words, but that would imply that we would need more time in our classrooms to be able to work on these things.
No, I think teachers overestimate their importance. Well, no, I'm serious about that. I think a lot of teachers believe that no learning occurs unless there is teaching. And that's a very strange belief when you actually sit down and examine it. In a language course, most learning should occur without teaching. And when I say teaching, I mean the teacher standing up the front and laying down the law, saying, you know, this is this, and explain this and that, so on. Now, if you take the strands of meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, and fluency development, they don't involve teaching in the way that I define teaching. They involve the teacher organizing the activity, setting up a speed reading course, setting up a regular use of the 4-3-2 activity for spoken fluency, perhaps presenting the material for listening to stories, and say maybe, you know, organizing 10-minute writing. But the teacher could just as well give a very, you know, capable learner the job of running 10-minute writing or running the speed reading course while the teacher whips out the back for a cigarette. You know, you could quite easily do that. And so 3/4 of that time is not teaching time, it's actually learners doing things. And learners can do speed reading courses at home. There are free speed reading courses at many different levels. I think at about 1, 2, 3, probably at 5 or 6 different levels, free on my website. And one of our ex-PhD students has now actually made an app which presents these courses and presents them free for learners to use and so on. So the teacher as an organizer is really important to make sure there's a balance of the strands and make sure that learners are doing these activities out of class or in class or whatever, you know, or in study groups and so on.
Great. I really like that idea, teacher as organizer. I might steal that one. We have one more question from the audience. Given that the suitability of the material used in activities vary according to learners' existing proficiency, how might we deal with groups of learners who vary quite a lot in their proficiency? Example, I've had to teach classes with students who ranged from A2 to C1 on the CEFR. Any thoughts or advice would be welcome.
Yeah. Well, this is where the 4 strands becomes important again. Because if you run a proper extensive reading program, each learner is reading at their own level. Now, there's a great resource that one of my ex-students developed called X-Reading, where a class or a school can subscribe to this program. And it's not very expensive. He makes it available cheaply, and they get access to several hundreds of graded readers at lots of different levels. And it's like a sort of subscription program, I think. And so that each learner then in extensive reading is reading the book, the book at the right level for them, you see. And the teacher doesn't have to do any real organizing at all, just enroll the students for it and they go ahead and do it. And that's extensive reading. And in speed reading courses, you know, you've got speed reading courses at lots of different levels. Okay, when learners do speed reading, they choose the course level or the teacher helps them choose the level of the speed reading course most suitable for them. And the teacher says, okay, are you ready? Go start your reading. And they read, but you know, different learners are reading different texts and reading at different levels. And so it's no big deal. I mean, in New Zealand, they have country schools, and country service schools involve the whole school contains less than 20 people, and one teacher or two teachers, if there's more than 14 students, teaches everybody from the primary school up to 12 years of age. And they do it with no big fuss or anything like that. People work in groups, people go off and do their independent work, and they become, you know, self-sufficient in their work. And these schools are terrific schools, you know, that are teaching learners who the width of proficiency level is even far beyond the levels you mentioned for the thing. You know, these are people from 5 years old to 12 years old. It's no big deal to set up learners doing work at the level which is most suitable for them.
Sure. Thank you for that. Last question. Professor Hall asked if there was a link to the speed reading app. Maybe you could share that with us later and we could share that with everyone else.
I'll have to think of what I'd be doing would be to search ESL speed reading, something like that. And
okay.
Yeah, I'll try and find it and send you the link. But I'm pretty sure it's freely available now.
Great. Thank you so much. Lots of thank yous in the chat for the talk as well as answering those questions. I think those are fantastic. And thank you everyone for joining us for this keynote